There is a curve in life that almost no one prepares us for. It does not appear on any map, it is not taught in schools, and it is rarely passed down in family conversations. People teach us how to strive, how to build careers, how to provide for a family, how to accumulate and preserve what we have gained. But almost no one speaks of the moment when the soul begins to shift direction. And what makes this moment even more remarkable is that it does not arrive in the fervent energy of youth, nor in the ambitious climb of middle age. It arrives quietly, unmistakably, around the age of 60. For many, 60 is imagined as the beginning of decline, the threshold of old age, the final stage where life is supposed to narrow down into limitation. But Jung, and those who have looked deeper, saw it differently. 60 is not an ending, it is the beginning of an entirely different kind of journey. A journey not outward into conquest or achievement, but inward, toward the essence of who we are. From the outside, nothing may appear to have changed. The body moves more slowly, the routines of the day feel familiar, emotions seem calmer, less turbulent than they once were. Friends and family may even look at you and say, "You seem the same." Yet inside, if you are quiet enough to notice, a subtle but powerful shift is taking place. The soul begins to turn. This turning is not a dramatic rupture. It does not announce itself with fireworks. It is more like a hidden current beneath the surface of a river, redirecting the flow without being seen. Bit by bit, the things that once defined your life begin to lose their urgency. The relentless drive to prove yourself eases. The compulsion to please others fades. Even the ambitions that you once carried like sacred banners begin to dissolve into the background. At 60, many describe this as a letting go, not of life itself, but of the unnecessary weight accumulated along the way. It is not defeat. It is not resignation. It is something quieter, wiser. It is as though the soul itself is whispering, "Enough of that. Now return to what truly matters." This is not retreat. It is not regression. It is return. Return to what was left behind in the hurried chase of decades past. Return to what was silenced in the sacrifices no one ever saw. Return to the empty spaces that once felt too frightening to face. Carl Jung captured this precisely when he wrote, "The first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego. The second half is going inward and letting go of it." For the first several decades of our existence, we labor tirelessly in the service of the ego. We study, we work, we build families, we accumulate, we adapt ourselves to the demands of society. We present images of ourselves to the world, images of competence, of strength, of worthiness. And for a long time, this feels like the only way to live. But then comes 60, and with it, a dawning realization. The carefully crafted ego is not the whole story. Behind it, beneath it, beyond it, there is something else that has waited patiently all along. That something is the soul. And when the soul decides to speak, it does not do so gently. The journey inward is not always easy. It often comes with pain, because the soul will no longer tolerate falseness. It refuses masks. It rejects roles played only for survival. It pushes back against every forced smile, every hollow obligation. It demands authenticity, and authenticity requires courage. This is why so many at 60 experience an unsettling sensation, a strange distance from their own lives. The things that once seemed meaningful suddenly resemble a performance stage on a theater they no longer recognize. The roles of dutiful parent, reliable worker, loyal partner, roles they once embodied so fully, now feel strangely hollow. Something within begins to say, "You are more than these roles." There is something else. Some call this feeling fatigue, but it is not the fatigue of the body. It is existential fatigue. the weariness that comes from living too long in patterns that never truly belong to us. It is the exhaustion of having been so outwardly useful, so endlessly busy, and yet inwardly absent from ourselves. This is not depression, though many confuse it with sadness. It is clarity. It is the soul knocking, reminding us that time is not infinite and that it is time to come home. What makes this turning point so difficult is that society does not prepare us for it. We are schooled in the ways of ambition. We are rewarded for productivity. We are praised for sacrifice, but no one teaches us how to release, how to listen inward, how to live authentically after a lifetime of masks. So when 60 arrives, most people are bewildered. They feel emptiness and cannot name it. They sense distance and cannot explain it. And yet, hidden inside this bewilderment is a profound invitation. 60 is not decline. It is a door. And if you have the patience to stop, to listen, to face what you have avoided, you will discover that the door does not lead into darkness. It opens into a new kind of light, the light of living not for the ego, but for the soul. To step through this door requires courage. It asks you to let go of old identities, to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, to admit that much of what you lived was survival more than expression. But beyond this honesty lies a freedom that younger years could never have imagined. The turning point at 60 is not the end of life. It is the beginning of true life. The question is whether we are willing to walk through. At 60, many people encounter a sensation that is difficult to put into words. It feels like a subtle estrangement from life as they have always known it. The routines remain the same. The family is still there. The responsibilities may even continue, and yet something inside whispers, this is not the whole story. It is not merely the slowing of the body or the passing of years. It is something deeper, a quiet but insistent realization that the old stage is no longer enough. The very roles that once gave structure and meaning now feel strangely hollow. The life that once seemed so full of purpose begins to resemble a carefully constructed performance. The applause has faded, the costumes are worn, and the soul, at last, is no longer content to play along. From the outside, it can look like peace. You seem calmer. You no longer rush from one ambition to the next. But within, there is a kind of fatigue that is not physical. It is existential fatigue, the exhaustion that comes not from work, but from having carried for too long the weight of pretending. It is the soul's way of saying, enough. It is time to change direction. Stop seeking outward for what can only be found within. This is why Jung spoke so often of the two halves of life. The first half is about adaptation, building the ego, creating identity, learning the rules of the world, proving ourselves to others. But the second half is different. It is about integration, about gathering the lost fragments of ourselves, about facing the shadows that were left behind in the rush of survival. The second half begins for many around 60. It begins with the call of the soul. And this call is not gentle. It does not whisper sweet reassurances. It demands truth. The soul at this age no longer tolerates the unnecessary. It rejects falsehood. It strips away the costumes we wore to survive. It insists that we stand bare, face to face with ourselves. That is why at 60, so many people feel compelled to look back. They review their marriage, their children, their career choices, their friendships. Old wounds resurface, but not simply to cause pain. They resurface to be healed, to be integrated, to be finally laid to rest. The past does not return to haunt. It returns to be embraced. At this stage, the longing of the soul changes. It no longer craves new titles or external recognition. It no longer seeks new possessions, another house, another car, another accomplishment to display. Instead, it yearns for silence, for peace, for the assurance that beneath the scars, beneath the struggles, beauty still exists. Meaning still exists. Something essential still waits to be discovered. This is why many describe their 60s as a time of cleansing. It is not a superficial cleaning of external things, but a symbolic cleansing of the inner life. Drawers of the heart are opened. Forgotten fears are discarded. Inherited beliefs are examined and released. There is forgiveness for those who never knew how to love properly. There is a soft letting go of the constant need to appear strong. And in front of the mirror, for the first time in decades, a person may see themselves without masks, without makeup, without lies, without the armor of pretense. It is a frightening sight for some to see oneself so unguarded, but it is also liberating, because in that unguarded reflection lives the possibility of a truer self, and that possibility is what the soul longs for most. The clarity that arises at this age is not to be mistaken for despair. It is not depression, though it may look similar from the outside. Depression closes doors. Clarity opens them. Depression extinguishes meaning. Clarity redefines it. When the soul calls, it is not dragging you into emptiness. It is inviting you into fullness, a fullness that has been overlooked in the chase of earlier decades. At 60, this call often arrives through simple realizations. Conversations that once felt lively suddenly seem dull. Clothes that once defined your image now feel pointless. Achievements that once brought pride now feel like burdens. And in that disillusionment, new questions begin to arise. What still moves me? What remains in me that no one else has touched? What would I do if I no longer needed to please anyone at all? These questions may seem unsettling, but they are sacred. They are the seeds of a new cycle of life. They mark the moment when time ceases to be measured in sheer quantity, how many years, how many accomplishments, and begins to be measured in quality. No longer is the urgency imposed from the outside by deadlines or social expectation. The urgency now comes from within, from the soul itself. To answer these questions is not easy. They may require painful honesty. They may require ending relationships that no longer nourish. They may demand stepping away from roles that have long defined us. They may call us back to passions abandoned decades earlier, or to a stillness we once avoided. But whatever the form, the soul insists. And in this insistence lies the quiet power of the 60s. For the first time in decades, life is no longer about survival or proving. It is about truth. It is about wholeness. It is about finally living not for others, not for society, but for the inner self that has waited patiently all along. This is why many describe their 60s as a paradoxical time. Outwardly, things appear stable, ordinary, even uneventful. But inwardly, everything is shifting. It is a time of invisible revolutions, and though it can be frightening because society does not prepare us for it, it is also sacred. It is the beginning of individuation in Jung's sense, the process of becoming whole. So, when you feel that distance at 60, when life suddenly seems like a play that no longer fits, remember, you are not broken. You are not lost. You are being called. The soul is inviting you to change direction. And though the path ahead may be unfamiliar, it leads to the deepest kind of freedom. The freedom of living as yourself, at last. There comes a moment in life, most vividly felt around the age of 60, when something within begins to stir with unmistakable force. It is as if a silent door opens, revealing a territory that has always existed but was never entered. This is the moment of awakening, when the soul begins to speak more clearly than ever before. At this stage, the things that once held your attention no longer satisfy. A new car, a promotion, another possession, or another accomplishment. These may once have fueled excitement, but now they lose their power. In their place emerges a different kind of questioning. These are not questions of achievement or recognition. They are questions of essence. What still has the power to move me? Who am I when all the masks are removed? If I no longer had to please anyone, how would I choose to live? These questions do not come by accident. They are the seeds of a new cycle of life. Just as a seed waits silently underground until the right season to sprout, so too does the soul wait until this stage of life to demand answers. And when the soul asks, it does not want borrowed truths. It asks for your truth, your unfiltered honesty. The awakening of the soul can be unsettling. It shakes the foundation of what once seemed stable. You may suddenly recognize that certain relationships no longer nourish you, that the work once done with passion now feels like a burden, that achievements you once cherished have become weights that no longer serve. This disruption is not destruction. It is the beginning of clarity. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." At 60, these words carry immense weight. True awakening does not come from clinging to ideals of perfection or light. It comes from facing what has long been avoided. The forgotten memories, the dreams that were never fulfilled, the parts of yourself that were silenced in order to fit in. All of these resurface, not to punish you, but to be acknowledged, integrated, and embraced. Strangely, the return of this inner darkness does not make you heavier. On the contrary, it lightens you. Because when you stop fearing what you once buried, you stop carrying the weight of avoidance. When you no longer hide from weakness, you discover strength. When you accept imperfection, you move closer to wholeness. This is why, at this stage, people often feel a sudden desire to change direction. Some return to study. Some end toxic relationships. Some begin again in places they once thought it was too late to try. These are not random impulses. They are the soul's response to awakening. They are signs that life is no longer measured by what is outwardly expected, but by what is inwardly true. The urgency of this awakening is not about time running out. It is about time becoming more real. A single authentic day begins to feel more valuable than decades spent living behind masks. A moment of genuine peace outweighs years of hollow striving. The soul, once awakened, demands quality over quantity. And yet, to honor this awakening requires courage. Courage to step away from roles that have defined you for decades. Courage to release relationships or identities that no longer align. Courage to admit that what once mattered deeply now no longer holds meaning. It asks for the bravery to begin again, even when the world insists it is too late. This is the paradox of awakening. It feels both liberating and frightening. Liberating because you finally sense the possibility of living as your true self. Frightening because it means dismantling the structures that once gave you security. But this dismantling is not loss. It is clearing space for authenticity. In this space, a new rhythm emerges. You learn that time is no longer about rushing. It is about presence. That meaning is no longer about proving. It is about being. That freedom is not escape from responsibility, but the freedom to live aligned with your essence. And perhaps the most important invitation in this awakening is to pause and ask yourself, if today I chose to live fully as myself, without needing to please anyone, what would that look like? Write your answer in the comments, not as a reply to the channel, but as a vow to yourself, a sentence that affirms your own truth. When you write it, you are not simply sharing, you are declaring to your soul, I am listening, I am ready. This simple act of acknowledgement is powerful. It is the first step in embodying the awakening, in shifting from questioning to living. And it is in this shift that the 60s become not a decline, but a rebirth. Carl Jung often spoke of the shadow, the hidden aspects of ourselves that we leave behind in the pursuit of acceptance, survival, or success. For much of life, the shadow remains in the background, shaping us silently without our awareness. But as the 60s unfold, the shadow no longer stays quiet. It asks for presence. This moment can be unsettling. Old memories resurface with startling clarity. Dreams long forgotten return with new insistence. Wounds that were never fully healed begin to ache again, not to reopen them, but to be acknowledged at last. The past does not reappear to haunt. It reappears to be integrated. What was once excluded from your story now demands its rightful place. And this, Jung believed, is the real work of the second half of life. Not conquering the world, but reconciling with the forgotten parts of the self. Only then can true wholeness emerge. At 60, integration becomes essential. It is no longer about pushing the shadow away. It is about turning toward it with courage. The shadow is not evil. It is simply what has been left unlived, the wounded child, the silenced intuition, the path not taken, the emotions never expressed. And when these elements are faced, they no longer act as hidden forces. They become sources of power, wisdom, and authenticity. This is why so many people at this stage suddenly feel compelled to change direction. They may leave jobs that once defined them. They may dissolve relationships that were once central but have grown toxic. They may return to old passions, art, study, music, writing, that once felt impossible to pursue. From the outside, such choices can look reckless, but inwardly, they are acts of liberation. They are the soul's way of reclaiming what was left behind. It is important to understand, the soul does not follow the ticking of the clock. It does not ask, "Am I too old for this?" It only asks, "Is this true?" When something resonates with authenticity, the soul urges us forward, regardless of age. That is why beginning again at 60, 70, or beyond is not only possible, it is often necessary. And what emerges from this integration is not heaviness, but lightness, because the energy once spent suppressing the shadow is freed. The fear once bound to silence is released. You discover that you do not need to be perfect. You only need to be whole. This awakening often comes with a surprising clarity about relationships. Many find they no longer wish to stay in connections that demand constant performance or sacrifice without reciprocity. The soul begins to crave authenticity over appearance, depth over comfort, honesty over convenience. Some bonds naturally fall away, while others grow stronger, refined by truth. This is not cruelty, it is alignment. It is the soul's way of surrounding itself only with what nourishes. At the same time, new possibilities open. Freed from the illusion of endless ambition, many find themselves drawn toward creativity, reflection, or service. The 60s and beyond often become fertile ground for writing memoirs, painting, mentoring, or returning to study. These are not hobbies. They are expressions of the integrated soul, outlets for what has long been waiting to come alive. And there is something else, subtler but profound, the sense of beginning again. For decades, life may have felt like a climb toward a peak. But now, rather than descending into decline, you find yourself entering an entirely new landscape, one that values truth over titles, presence over productivity. What once looked like an ending reveals itself as a threshold. This is the paradox that few speak of, that in the 60s, life often demands more of us, not less. Not in terms of external productivity, but in terms of authenticity. The unfinished business of the soul comes to the surface, and it insists on being addressed. It is not satisfied with half measures. It does not want roles. It wants reality. And yes, it can be frightening. Society rarely portrays this stage as anything but decline. The cultural narrative tells us that aging means fading, losing, shrinking. But Jung saw the opposite. He described this time as the richest, the most symbolic, the most fertile for transformation. Because only when the ego softens, when the masks dissolve, does the soul finally step forward to lead. If you are in this stage, you may already sense it. The moments of sudden clarity, the realization that some friendships no longer feel alive, the recognition that certain fears no longer hold power, the quiet courage to say no without guilt and yes without hesitation. These are not small shifts. They are signs that the soul is integrating, reclaiming what was once split apart. This process, however, requires silence. The soul does not shout. It whispers. It appears in recurring dreams, in sudden emotions, in longings you cannot explain. To listen is to honor it. To ignore is to prolong the dissonance. And in listening, something remarkable happens. Darkness itself transforms. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a womb. What once felt like loneliness begins to reveal itself as a meeting with what is essential, with what has always been there, patiently waiting to be embraced. This integration brings a new kind of freedom, a freedom not based on escaping responsibility, but on finally living in alignment with yourself. A freedom that comes from no longer hiding, no longer performing, no longer apologizing for being who you are. And perhaps here lies the question worth asking yourself. What part of myself have I left behind that I am now ready to reclaim? Write it down, even in a single sentence. Let it be your affirmation in the comments below. Not for anyone else, but for yourself. A quiet declaration that you are ready to gather what was once lost. When you claim what has been left behind, you step into a new beginning. Not the beginning of striving, but the beginning of wholeness. And it is in this wholeness that the 60s reveal their hidden treasure, the realization that life is not ending. It is finally becoming real. There is a kind of spring that only arrives after the storms of life, a spring that does not resemble the vibrant, hurried blossoming of youth. It is not the restless spring of untested dreams or boundless ambition. It is a quieter season, one that blooms only after the roots have survived droughts and floods, after the branches have endured harsh winds. It is the silent spring of the soul, a season that awakens most clearly around the age of 60. In this spring, the body may move slower, but the soul quickens. It no longer seeks victory or applause, no longer reaches for new titles or outward achievements. Instead, it hungers for presence. Life is no longer measured by accumulation, but by the depth of each moment. A quiet morning with a cup of tea may now feel more precious than a decade of striving. A genuine touch, a silent gaze of understanding, or a single mindful breath at sunrise becomes a treasure beyond measure. In the silent spring, time itself begins to change meaning. It is no longer a river rushing forward, demanding that you keep pace. It becomes a still lake, inviting you to reflect, to pause, to live more deeply. You no longer count days by tasks completed. You begin to sense their value by how fully you inhabited them. This is not retreat. It is refinement. It is the soul learning that depth matters more than duration. Love, too, changes in this season. It is no longer bound by fantasy or unmet expectation. It becomes a conscious choice, not love that seeks to complete you, but love that walks beside you. It no longer depends on displays or validation. It reveals itself in presence, in silence, shared without discomfort, in space, honored without fear, in eyes that recognize without demand. Fear also shifts. After decades of falling and rising, fear loses its sharpness. It becomes a reminder, not a tyrant. You realize that what once seemed terrifying has already been faced and survived. Scars that once felt like burdens now speak as witnesses to resilience. And in this quiet recognition, wisdom deepens, not the wisdom learned from books, but the wisdom etched into the body, spoken through the eyes, and carried in silence. The beauty of the silent spring is subtle, but profound. It does not shout. It does not clamor for attention. It radiates quietly from within. It shows itself in the lines on the face, each one a map of storms endured and lessons absorbed. It lingers in pauses, in voices that no longer rush. It is beauty without filter, without mask, without striving. Precisely because it does not demand to be seen, it becomes the rarest kind of beauty, the beauty of truth. This is also the time when reconciliation begins. You no longer scold yourself for past mistakes. You no longer resent the choices that led to pain. Instead, you begin to see your past selves with compassion, understanding that in every moment you did the best you could with what you knew. This is not resignation. It is liberation. It frees you from the weight of blame and grants you the lightness to live forward without the chains of regret. Forgiveness, when it finally arrives, does not erase the scars. It transforms them into teachers. And in that transformation, you find the wisdom of release, the wisdom of knowing what no longer needs to be carried. This is a wisdom that cannot be taught to the young. It emerges only from having lived, endured, lost, and risen again. The freedom of the silent spring is unlike any freedom known before. It is not the reckless freedom of youth, nor the ambitious freedom of middle age. It is the freedom of alignment, the freedom of no longer pretending, no longer performing, no longer apologizing for existing as you are. It is a freedom that asks little, yet means everything. In this season, connection also takes on a different form. It is not built on noise or constant activity, but on depth and presence. Conversations do not need many words to matter. A nod, a pause, a quiet recognition can hold more weight than hours of speech. Here, solitude itself transforms. It no longer feels like emptiness. It becomes companionship with the self. Silence becomes a refuge, not a void. And when silence becomes a refuge, the soul begins to shine. Not with brilliance that blinds, but with a glow that warms. Like twilight light spilling across the horizon, it does not demand attention, but whoever stands near feels its presence. It is steady, enduring, and unmistakably real. The silent spring is not about withdrawal from life. It is about entering life more honestly. You no longer cling to the illusion of permanence. You no longer chase the endless race of achievement. You allow yourself to inhabit what is real: breath, presence, love, truth. This is where wisdom blooms, not as knowledge to teach, but as a way of being that quietly transforms those around you. Perhaps the most important question in this season is, in the time that remains, how will I choose to live so that every moment carries true meaning? If you feel called, write your answer in the comments. Not for the channel, not for others, but for yourself. Let it be a quiet vow, a seed planted for your own silent spring. Because when you give voice to that vow, you honor the soul's deepest longing, not to conquer, not to prove, but simply to be. And in that being, in that quiet authenticity, life finally reveals itself as it was always meant to be. Not a struggle to become, but a celebration of what already is. We have now traveled together through 5 chapters of this journey, beginning with the turning point at 60, the call of the soul, the awakening of deeper questions, the integration of shadow, and finally, the silent spring where wisdom blooms. Each stage has shown us that 60 is not an ending, but the beginning of a truer way of living. If you have stayed with me until now, perhaps there's already a question stirring inside you, or a quiet sentence you feel ready to affirm for yourself. I invite you to write it in the comments, not for the channel, not for anyone else, but as a way of acknowledging to your own soul, I am listening. I am ready. If these reflections have touched you, I warmly encourage you to subscribe to this channel so we can continue walking this path of wisdom and healing together. And if you know someone standing at a similar turning point, share this video with them. It might be the light they are waiting for. Thank you for giving your time, your presence, and your heart to this journey. May you carry with you the peace of your own silent spring, and may every day ahead be lived with truth, with freedom, and with the quiet joy of simply being yourself.